It looks like I keep finding Buicks to talk about, and well, that's not an issue because they're pretty awesome vehicles, especially from this era. And today we're going to talk about this lime green, yes, that is the name of this color, lime green 1969 Buick Electra deuce-na-quarter. Now, the deuce-na-quarter nameplate came about because the cars were actually 225 inches long. And that would generally hold true until the 1970s era when, well, they got bigger, largely because of the bumpers. But the deuce-na-quarter nickname certainly stuck for the Buick Electra, even if the cars didn't measure 225 inches in overall length. However, that was still holding true here in 1969. This car measured 224.8 inches in overall length and rode atop 126-inch wheelbase. So it did actually fulfill the Electra 225 moniker. Now, 1969 was the penultimate year for this particular version of the Electra. It was introduced in 1965. It would undergo annual model year styling changes. The last year of this particular body style was 1970 before it was re-engineered and reintroduced as an all-new car for 1971. The 69 model from a styling perspective isn't necessarily my favorite. I think it's a handsome car. It's not necessarily a pretty car. And I think that really owes to the front end. I just happen to prefer the 1968 front end of the Electras better. Again, just personal preference, but this certainly is not an ugly car. Now take a look up front and you'll see this big loop-style bumper that encompasses the entire front end. This was in vogue during the time and was found on many vehicles, not just from General Motors, but also from other automakers, including, for example, Chrysler, who featured it rather prominently on vehicles for a number of years thereafter. The loop bumper trend here on this Electra would last just for the 1969 and 1970 model years. I guess it was a bit of a fad, and like I said, you saw it from the General Motors stable on Buicks. Probably the most prominent example would be the Chevrolet from this era that also had the loop bumper. Pontiac, of course, had its Endura front end by this point, and you can kind of say the Endura front end maybe what really introduced the bumper styling of the modern era because they weren't chrome bumpers anymore. It's almost like a front fascia that was flexible, very similar to what we have on cars today. Now, the loop bumper was perhaps pretty popular during this era because, remember, this was the era of Ralph Nader, who had written the book Unsafe at Any Speed about the Chevrolet Corvair and its handling abilities, or lack thereof, at least in his opinion. And so automakers were trying to make cars safer and, frankly, appear safer. The loop bumper kind of connoted that you had this entire front end that was helping protect you and keep you safe. It still was a decorative bumper, and if you hit something, well, the bumper was definitely going to dent or compress to some degree. However, I do like how the bumper continues, the fender forms. You can see that very sharp crease that forms the top of the fender is continued into the bumper. You also have, from the grille texture standpoint, the egg crate grille. And if you're a fan of the channel, you know that egg crate connotes luxury. Why? I don't know, but Cadillacs had egg crate grills. The Oldsmobile 98s typically had egg crate grills versus the 88s of this era that had more thin bladed grills. And the Electra here also had the egg crate grill. And of course, Chevrolet would often copy the egg crate grill texture, maybe most prominently on the 71, where they pretty obviously copied Cadillac styling. But the egg crate texture was something that connoted luxury, and that's why it belonged on this Electra. Overall, though, it's very clear the designers were trying to emphasize the overall width of this car using the loop bumper and various techniques. And of course, you want to make an 80-inch car look wider because it's not wide enough. Now, if you look at the hood, this was a kind of the waning years of the W-shaped front end. And by this point, this front end really doesn't have nearly as much of the W shape as previous Buicks had, even the 68. They've really toned it down and blunted it because of that loop bumper. You couldn't have the same plan view and have the middle area stick out as far to form the W shape. So it's starting to go away by this point. And that W-shaped front end and rear end, again, was kind of a 1960s, early 1970s era hallmark of many vehicles. Here, like I said, it's starting to go away because of the style of the bumper. You have on the hood this area that kind of slopes down toward the bumper. that would be used on Buicks through the 1970 model year before they would be redesigned. And you also have, I guess, what I'll call an inverse barbell theme. The barbell theme would be a car like the Tornado, where you have a skinnier section in the middle and then fatter on the outer ends. Here you got the inverse of that. You got these scalloped sections on the outer ends and then a fatter section in the middle where the wind split molding is, just to give the hood some dimension and a few features. Now, as we rotate around to the side of this vehicle, you see a pretty predominant theme that was unique to Buick during this era, and that is that diving, I'll call it, character line, as well as the body side molding, which accentuates it. That was kind of an evolution of a swage line that Buick had on earlier cars, kind of the so-called S character line that was on the body side. And here it's even accentuated by the body side molding itself, which has to be one of the longest body side moldings on any vehicle. Notice how it starts ahead of the front wheel, wraps around there, and then kind of dives downward all the way to the point where it's connecting to a portion of the rear bumper. I think it's a pretty handsome execution of a protective feature of the car. Oftentimes these body side moldings look like they were tacked on, but this one looks like it was actually styled in, and that's because it was. I do also like how that character line, that diving character line, is pretty, I would say, dominantly filleted, and that means that it's got a concave surface that starts to form it above the apex of the character line. And that gives it just a more accentuated, let's say, look in the sunlight here. You certainly notice it, particularly look at the door and how accentuated that character line is. It starts to fade out a little bit as it goes rearward, and notice it grows fatter as it approaches the front of the car and then kind of envelops the 4 ventiports that would be characteristic of upper-end Buicks. Had to have those 4 ventiports if you were an upper-end Buick, unless it was a Riviera. But notice, like I said, that character line, that surface just gets larger and larger as it approaches the front of the vehicle, and it gradually just fades out beautifully. It's gone. It gets sharper and sharper as it goes rearward on the car, and this, I think, just describes the beauty of what General Motors was doing with its styling back in this era. The chief designer for this vehicle was a gentleman by the name of Dave Holz, who would go and lead a number of studios for General Motors. He would also be responsible for the 1970 to 72 Monte Carlo. He was the person who designed the supreme development of the fin on the 1959 Cadillacs. And Dave was also the individual who, I think later in his career, had a real home run when he was head of advanced design with the 1992 Eldorado and Seville. Dick Rusin was actually the chief designer of those. But Dave Holz also had a role in those vehicles as an executive at General Motors Design. So a very storied career for this gentleman. And like I said, this was his time at the top of the Buick helm. I think the best Buick that he ever did was arguably the 1966 Riviera. That's also a Dave Holz car. By the way, I think one of Dave's favorite vehicles that he actually did was the 70.5 Chevrolet Camaro. That was a Dave Holz design. He also spent a fair amount of time overseas at GM Opel. So a celebrated GM designer and one of the best in history, frankly. Now let's rotate around to the rear of the vehicle, and we'll notice quite a few styling elements here. First of all, make note of the tail lamps and what kind of texture do you see within the tail lamps. The so-called egg crate texture, and that's drawing the front and the rear together with that similar theme. Pay attention on a lot of vehicles, and you'll see the designers try to have themes that are incorporated into the front also incorporated into the rear of the vehicle, and that's one area where that's done here. Now, remember I described the W-shaped front end up front and how it was kind of blunted because of that loop-style bumper. You see a little bit of a vestige of it here. Certainly the outer ends of the Ws are prominent with those quarter panels jutting away from the deck lid. It's just a very small crease that runs the center of the deck lid that arguably forms the smallest middle point of the W here. Again, this W style was going away, and I suspect they toned it down on the rear from previous models as well because the front had been toned down. Now, I do love how the rear bumper, this is a decorative rear bumper, is integrated beautifully into the styling of the quarter panel, just continuing the line that goes unbroken basically from the C-pillar all the way back and then loops around to the bottom of the car. You also have this feature line that runs down that quarter panel that starts far in advance of it and kind of gives that quarter panel a beveled dimension. I don't know what else to call it. But otherwise, it would look rather flat, and there's not much surfacing to this quarter panel aside from that body side molding and then that feature line that runs around the top of it. And I think it's got a beautiful simplicity to it. It also helps accentuate, let's just say, the largeness of the car and the relative height of it, because there isn't much to break up that surface. So from this rear three-quarter view, it looks a little chunky and muscular, especially when you incorporate that vertical style C-pillar, which again was a luxury Q. You look at Cadillacs from the era, you have this very vertical style C-pillar and backlight, which the Buick has here replicated. I'll also just draw your attention to the radius on the C-pillar and how that's formed. It's unfortunate this car has a vinyl top because it's kind of masking the overall beauty of that C-pillar and the radius that the designers chose to make that transition from the side of the vehicle to the backlight. But you can kind of see it here, how the light is breaking over it. It's just a smooth, soft kind of radius that's perfectly tailored to the vehicle, and I think perfectly tailored to this vertical style C-pillar, which again was characteristic of luxury cars all the way back to the coach building era of vehicles. I think that's where that originally had come from. And as we take a look at this left side or driver's side view of the vehicle, I do want to point out something that I think is really highlighted by this particular photo, and that is that while this car certainly has a distinct luxury-like presence, it's designed to kind of give it this sense of motion while it's standing still. What do I mean by that? Take a look at the rake of the C-pillar and the rake of the quarter panel, how they're all slanted forward, and in particular, that quarter panel and the bumper, how it's slanted forward. And then that is accentuated, that overall kind of forward motion look of the car is accentuated by that diving body side molding that kind of looks like the car is ready to pounce almost. And you see that in this view, I think, better than any other view. It's just a kind of beautiful elegance to the car. Also perhaps accentuated by the wheel arches. Notice how they kind of are scooped back and rearward, and the front of the wheel arch is a different angle from the rear of the wheel arch. Again, just lending that sense of motion to the overall car. Beautifully done. It's just amazing. The more you look at this car, I think the more you tend to appreciate its simplicity, but also what the designers were trying to do during this time frame. And another little beautiful detail, the Buick Tri-Shield emblem during this time frame, I think, was just spectacular. It later would kind of get less detail in it. It would still have the tri-colors, at least for some time, and then Buick would drop the colors, and now they have a totally different Tri-Shield logo. But I like the little reindeer. I don't know what else to call them. And the overall design, it's kind of like a coat of arms, and I think it's a handsome look. And I will say the great thing about the 69 Electras as opposed to the 70s Electras as an example, the 1970 Electra in particular, that 70 Electra has this emblem on a plastic trim piece that is often broken and fallen off, and very rarely will you see a 1970 Electra with its original Tri-Shield emblem on front, or any 1970 Buick for that matter. Here, this is metal, and thankfully it is preserved as a consequence of that. Now let's flip to the interior because, well, nothing more green than this interior. You certainly don't see this color out interiors today, but it was popular in the late 60s, early 1970s. Heck, everybody had avocado-looking refrigerators, or I think also almond was becoming a popular color during this time frame. You know what? It looks good on this car. I would drive this car any day. And you have a beautiful front bench seat. Buick seats had extra padding. Look how fat that seat back is and the seat bottom. These were comfortable cars, comfortable riding cars. They also were kind of lazy cruisers, and I say that in a positive way. Standard rear end in a lot of these Electras was 256-1, which actually endowed them with pretty good fuel economy on the freeway. My 1970 Electra on the freeway, I routinely got 17 miles per gallon, 18 miles per gallon with a 455 cubic inch carbureted V8 and a 3-speed automatic transmission. I'd say that's pretty damn good. And if we flip to the instrument cluster, we'll see a very interesting theme, let's say, because it looks like a series of picture frames that are on one's desk. Everything is kind of framed with chrome from the top left there, the idiot lights for brake and engine temperature. There's also the speed alert. That's what that says, that little rotating knob. And you'll notice on the speedometer, there's two pointers. There's the red one, which is the actual speedometer, and then there's the one with the white dot. That is the speed alert. And if the red pointer crosses that white dot, you get the worst noise imaginable. It goes to tell you that you have passed a preset speed. So I guess in this particular case, the driver didn't want to exceed 65 miles per hour. I usually set that speed alert setting at like 100 miles an hour because I don't want to hear that dying swan song. Of course, you have the lights below that, the temperature control. This is a manual temperature control unit. Buick did have automatic temperature control. Interestingly, with no temperature markings on their automatic temperature control. I don't know why Buick did that, but they did. The wiper switch, of course, the fuel gauge on the right-hand side of the instrument panel. I think it's handsome. I like this kind of picture frame style instrument panel, though some think it's a little too boxy. And then over here on this door panel, I love this beautifully elegant trim piece, this kind of metallic trim piece that rises and has its fattest area right below the door pull. I think it just sets it off quite well. Of course, you have the full-length center armrest because this is an Electra after all. You can't have a little stubby armrest. And then the typical GM door handle of the era that many GM vehicles used, this kind of safety-style door handle that was recessed into the armrest so that you didn't accidentally pull on it. And you can tell this was a well-cared-for example because this has these kind of scalloped-out door trays that house the 4 power window switches as well as the 6-way power seat switch. And they collected moisture. They would often pit. This one is in really nice shape, as is the dash. So this was a well-cared-for example. By the way, this car is for sale on Bring a Trailer. So if you're interested in it, it can be yours. Go check it out on Bring a Trailer. And as we transition to the underhood area, we see Buick's exclusive 430 cubic inch 4-barrel V8. This was an all-new design introduced for the 1967 model year when it replaced the venerable Buick Nailhead V8 from prior years that Buick had used for 1953 through 1966. The 430 was a pretty good engine overall. Some of the early years had oiling issues. The oil pumps on these can have some issues. The timing covers, especially if you have to replace the water pump. But overall, very good engine. I mentioned previously these had a 256-to-1 rear end, so very lazy rear end. They're not overly snappy off the line. They have plenty of torque. But I think the amazing thing about these is the passing power. If you stomp on it at about 55 or 60 miles an hour, the transmission kicks down into second gear, which it'll hold up to about 90 miles an hour because of that lazy rear end. And the highway passing power with these Buicks is actually pretty strong, surprisingly strong for how large the vehicle is. The Buick V8, super smooth, very quiet, well-built, well-engineered. It's hard to distinguish what is the best of the General Motors big block V8 engines. Buick did have a small and a big block. They had obviously this 430. They also had various displacements, like 350 cubic inches. They later had a 455. But this particular 430, this was the last year for the 430, 1969, before it would be enlarged to 455 cubic inches in 1970. This is also a premium fuel 430, making 360 horsepower, 475 pound-feet of torque. Those are gross figures that are measured without the engine accessories and the air cleaner and the exhaust. In 1972, the industry would switch to net horsepower rating. So they seem a little bit inflated compared to later year figures, but very smooth and powerful overall V8 engine. And it wouldn't be a Buick if it didn't have a huge trunk. Take a look at that trunk. It's made even larger by the massively tall quarter panels. So you could fit 8 golf bags in here, 6 dead bodies, and whatever nefarious stuff that you wanted to. But one thing was for sure on these vehicles, you were not going to run out of trunk room on your 1969 Electra. And, great road trip car. Imagine taking this and the family on a road trip somewhere. You could pull your trailer. You could easily pull 5,000 pounds with these vehicles. Buicks actually had thicker gauge frames than other General Motors vehicles of this era. And that was really due to their chief designer, Leo Kintig, who was a bit of a race car driver and wanted Buicks to feel like they were made from a solid billet of steel. And if you drive a Buick of this era, this late 60s era, you will feel that, and you'll feel the difference versus the General Motors divisions. They are a great stiff chassis And it's an amazing contrast, I would say, when compared to the 1971 vehicles where the chassis was much more flexible. If you want the best Buicks, I would say get one from the 1965 to 70 generation. That would be my vote. Although the 61 to 5 generation are, arguably even more beautiful and are also well built too. And I hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the Green Monster, the 1969 Buick Electra. No, not Fenway Park, but this beautiful Buick that we just showcased here. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Put a comment. What do you think of it? And let me know any vehicles that you would like me to review as well. Thanks again for watching.